Buy Black Podcast, Episode 11. Why the Black community needs to embrace gun ownership and take control of our Second Amendment rights. Welcome to Buy Black, the only podcast dedicated to helping you find, connect with, and support Black-owned businesses. We're on a mission to bring consumers and business owners together to ignite the global Black economy. I'm your host, Gerald Jones, and if you're a Black business owner or a socially conscious consumer, you've joined the right community. Ready? Let's get to work. Hey guys, welcome back to Buy Black. I hope you guys have had as good of a week as you possibly could with all the things going on in our nation over this last week. Today, I do not have a new interview to bring to you, to share with you today. This week's episode, I feel like I've got to talk about this problem that's been highlighted again this week, this problem that always bugs me, that always bothers me, this problem of not guns, but the problem of bad people with guns being able to kill a lot of people without guns with impunity. That has always bothered me, and it will always bother me. So in today's episode, what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to share a little bit of knowledge and information that I know we've all been exposed to before. I hope we've all been exposed to before about gun control. Now, I'll tell you right now, I am not an advocate of sweeping gun control. I am not an advocate of nobody should have a gun. I'm a former United States Marine. I was an infantryman. I lived with my weapon. It was literally a part of me. And for a time after I came back from overseas, the 2 times that I went, I felt naked. Anybody who's experienced this, anybody who's been in the military in a situation where you actually have a weapon and use a weapon regularly and it's a part of your life, when you're back at home and away from that, you will catch yourself looking around because you feel like you left your weapon sitting down somewhere. Like you have a small flashback of, holy crap, where's my weapon? And you start looking around because it should be on you. You start holding your hands even when you don't have a weapon in such a way that it looks like you're carrying a weapon. It's muscle memory. That's a part of who I am. I feel more comfortable when I have a weapon that I can use to defend myself, just in case there's a bad person in the vicinity nearby who decides they want to do bad things. I don't trust somebody else to defend myself, to defend my family. That's what I was put here to do. And as a citizen in the United States, it should be my right to carry a weapon to do just that. So it bothers me every time the initial reaction to one of these situations is, okay, we've got our chance. These people are dead. These families are missing brothers, sisters, fathers, mothers, sons, daughters. And right now, when they're at their most vulnerable, when they're at their most hurt, now is our chance to go for their rights because they will be happy to hand them over to us in exchange for a little bit of security right now, but we got to move quick. That always bothers me. It's so sadistic. Now, I understand the need for smart regulation of weapons. I understand that there's just certain types of things you don't need in a society like ours. Like this guy who had all of these weapons and he was using these bump stocks that basically made his AR rifles function as if they were fully automatic. You know, basically the recoil from the weapon reloads another round and fires it using this bump stock setup. You know, that modification, there's no reason for that modification on any weapon that you would use for hunting, on any weapon that you would use for self-defense. You know, unless the zombie apocalypse is happening and there are hordes surrounding you, there is literally no reason to have that because the only thing it can do is inflict mass carnage. So I get that. I get that reaction to say, okay, this thing we need to go after because it basically is a way that they're getting around a law that's already in place to prevent people from having fully automatic weapons. So there's a reasonable part of everything. But just the sweeping, nobody needs to have guns. See what happens? It bothers me because we need to have guns. Specifically, black people in the United States, the people who are the loudest proponents of gun control, need to have guns in the United States to protect ourselves. You know, the very first thing that was taken from us as soon as the Civil War was over and the 13th Amendment was passed and the 14th Amendment was passed, what's the very first thing they took? They implemented these black codes in the southern states, and the very first thing was no black person is allowed to have a gun. Even before slavery was over, when there were free black people, the states had laws that said even free black people are not allowed to have guns. Now, why is that? Why is it that as soon as slaves became free, the very first laws that were passed were you can't have a weapon? I know the basic answer is, well, they were afraid of a revolt. They were afraid of a little bit of revenge. Okay, there might have been some of that, but the actuality is, and what we saw play out is, so long as a population is disarmed, it can be terrorized. So long as a population is disarmed, then when those people go to try to vote for their own government, we can kill them. We can block them. We can go into their homes and their churches, and we can take them out, and we can make examples of them so that all the rest will fall in line. And we don't have to worry about a thing because they can't defend themselves. It was the first thing taken away from newly freed slaves was the right to keep and bear arms, because that gives you the right to defend your family and your property from aggressors. And the black community in this nation is surrounded by people who have always been aggressors towards us, towards our families. And we have always been in a position to have to beg for a little bit of freedom, to have to beg for a little bit of dignity, to have to appeal to a group who has all the power to their conscience and say, please see me as a fellow human being. Don't murder me. And here we are 150 years later, and we are the biggest proponents of taking away, of keeping out of our hands the tools that every other demographic in this society uses to protect themselves and their property, and which the law protects our right to keep and protect ourselves and our property. We're the first ones to beg to have it taken away. Do you really think that if gun control legislation is passed, that every other group is actually going to have their guns taken away? That the white majority in this nation is going to have their guns taken away? It won't happen, because those gun laws, the Second Amendment of the Constitution in the United States is designed for citizens, white citizens, to be able to protect themselves and their family against two things. First, it was the government and Native Americans, and now it is the government and black people. That's why the Second Amendment exists. So there will never be a time where the white population in the United States is not armed to the teeth and able to walk around in the streets, rifles slung over their back, handguns in a holster on their hip, shaking hands with the police, walking free. There's no threat in that. That's what the law was designed to do. It's us, black people, who are assumed to have some type of a negative intent if we're seen with a weapon. However legal or illegal that weapon may be, Philando Castile, it is assumed that if we have a weapon, that we are a threat. And because of that assumption, anyone in the vicinity who is white has the right to put us down. Even today in 2017, we still see that. That's still our reality. We are not allowed to carry weapons in the United States. And yet we are the first people to propose even further restrictions on our right to carry weapons in the United States. It doesn't make sense to me. So I'm going to read a little something today from a pamphlet that was released by Ida B. Wells in 1892. And it was specifically a pamphlet that went out in opposition, a pamphlet that went out in support of changing the lynch laws in the South. The laws that allowed mob rule to take over. When a black person was accused, usually of raping a white woman, mobs were allowed to take over to the point that even if this person was arrested and in jail, a mob of white men could go to that jail, demand that they hand over the prisoner, and in most cases, sheriff would hand over the prisoner and they would take him out and they would lynch him. No trial, no rule of law, mob rule. It was fine so long as the perpetrator was black. And the easiest way to get it done, a white woman says that she was raped. So Ida B. Wells wrote this pamphlet, and it's pretty long, but I just want to read the last section of it. It's called Self-Help, and it will make sense and tie into what we're talking about here. All right, so this last section of this pamphlet, the pamphlet itself is called Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in All Its Phases. In this last section, I'll begin. It reads, in the creation of this healthier public sentiment, the Afro-American can do for himself what no one else can do for him. The world looks on with wonder that we have conceded so much and remain law-abiding under such great outrage and provocation. To Northern capital and Afro-American labor, the South owes its rehabilitation. If labor is withdrawn, capital will not remain. The Afro-American is thus the backbone of the South. A thorough knowledge and judicious exercise of this power in lynching localities could many times effect a bloodless revolution. The white man's dollar is his God, and to stop this will be to stop outrages in many localities. The Afro-Americans in Memphis denounced the lynching of 3 of their best citizens and urged and waited for the authorities to act in the matter and bring the lynchers to justice. No attempt was made to do so, and the black men left the city by thousands, bringing great stagnation in every branch of business. Those who remained so injured the business of the streetcar company by staying off the cars that the superintendent, manager, and treasurer called personally on the editor of the Free Speech. This was a black editorial newspaper that was in Memphis at the time. Called personally on the editor of the Free Speech, asked them to urge our people to give them their patronage again. Other businessmen became alarmed over the situation, and the Free Speech was run away that the colored people might be more easily controlled. A meeting of white citizens in June, 3 months after the lynching, passed resolutions for the first time condemning it, but they did not punish the lynchers. Every one of them was known by name because they had been selected to do the dirty work by some of the very citizens who passed these resolutions. Memphis is fast losing her black population, who proclaim as they go that there is no protection for the life and property of any Afro-American citizen in Memphis who is not a slave. The Afro-American citizens of Kentucky, whose intellectual and financial improvement has been phenomenal, have never had a separate car law until now. Delegations and petitions poured into the legislature against it, yet the bill passed and the Jim Crow car of Kentucky is a legalized institution. Will the great mass of Negroes continue to patronize the railroad? A special from Covington, Kentucky says, Covington, June 13th. The railroads of the state are beginning to feel very markedly the effects of the separate coach bill recently passed by the legislature. No class of people in the state have so many and so largely attended excursions as the blacks. All these have been abandoned, and regular travel is reduced to a minimum. A competent authority says the loss of the various roads will reach $1 million this year. A call to a state conference in Lexington, Kentucky last June had delegates from every county in the state. Those delegates, the ministers, teachers, heads of secret and other orders, and the head of every family should pass the word around for every member of the race in Kentucky to stay off railroads unless obliged to ride. If they did so, and their advice was followed persistently, the convention would not need to petition the legislature to repeal the law or raise money to file a suit. The railroad corporations would be so affected, they would in self-defense lobby to have the separate car law repealed. On the other hand, as long as the railroads can get Afro-American excursions, they will always have plenty of money to fight all the suits brought against them. They will be aided in so doing by the same partisan public sentiment which passed the law. White men passed the law, and white judges and juries would pass upon the suits against the law and render judgment in line with their prejudices and in deference to the greater financial power. The appeal to the white man's pocket has ever been more effectual than all the appeals ever made to his conscience. Nothing, absolutely nothing, is to be gained by a further sacrifice of manhood and self-respect. By the right exercise of his power as the industrial factor of the South, the Afro-American can demand and secure his rights, the punishment of lynchers, and a fair trial for accused rapists. Of the many inhuman outrages of this present year, the only case where the proposed lynching did not occur was where the men armed themselves in Jacksonville, Florida, and in Paducah, Kentucky, and prevented it. The only times an Afro-American who was assaulted got away has been when he had a gun and used it in self-defense. The lesson this teaches, and which every Afro-American should ponder well, is that a Winchester rifle should have a place of honor in every black home, and it should be used for that protection which the law refuses to give. When the white man, who is always the aggressor, knows he runs as great a risk of biting the dust every time his Afro-American victim does, he will have greater respect for African-American life. The more the Afro-American yields and cringes and begs, the more he has to do so, the more he is insulted, outraged, and lynched. The assertion has been substantiated throughout these pages that the press contains unreliable and doctored reports of lynchings. And one of the most necessary things for the race to do is to get these facts before the public. The people must know before they can act, and there is no educator to compare with the press. The Afro-American papers are the only ones which will print the truth, and they lack means to employ agents and detectives to get at the facts. The race must rally a mighty host to the support of their journals, and thus enable them to do much in the way of investigation. A lynching occurred at Port Jarvis, New York, the first week in June. A white and colored man were implicated in the assault upon a white girl. It was charged that the white man paid the colored boy to make the assault, which he did on the public highway in broad daytime, and was lynched. This too was done by parties unknown. The white man in the case still lives. He was imprisoned and promises to fight the case on trial. At the preliminary examination, it developed that he had been a suitor of the girl's. She had repulsed and refused him, yet had given him money, and he had sent threatening letters demanding more. The day before this examination, she was so wrought up, she left home and wandered miles away. When found, she said she did so because she was afraid of the man's testimony. Why should she be afraid of the prisoner? Why should she yield to his demands for money if not to prevent him from exposing something he knew? It seems explainable only on the hypothesis that a liaison existed between the colored boy and the girl, and the white man knew of it. The press is singularly silent. Has it a motive? We owe it to ourselves to find out. The story comes from Larned, Kansas, October 1st, that a young white lady held at bay until daylight, without alarming anyone in the house, a burly Negro, quotations, who entered her room and bed. The burly Negro was promptly lynched without investigation or examination of inconsistent stories. A house was found burned down near Montgomery, Alabama in Monroe County, October 13th, a few weeks ago. Also the burned bodies of the owners and melted piles of gold and silver. These discoveries led to the conclusion that the awful crime was not prompted by motives of robbery. The suggestion of the whites was that brutal lust was the incentive, and as there are nearly 200 Negroes living within a radius of 5 miles of the place, the conclusion was inevitable that some of them were the perpetrators. Upon this suggestion, probably made by the real criminal, the mob acted upon the conclusion and arrested 10 Afro-Americans, 4 of whom, they tell the world, confessed to the deed of murdering Richard L. Johnson and outraging his daughter, Jeanette. These 4 men, Beryl Jones, Moses Johnson, Jim and John Packer, none of them 25 years of age, upon this conclusion were taken out from the jail, hanged, shot, and burned while yet alive the night of October 12th. The same report says Mr. Johnson was on the best of terms with his Negro tenants. The race thus outraged must find out the facts of this awful hurling of men into eternity on supposition, and give them to the indifferent and apathetic country. We feel this to be a garbled report, but how can we prove it? Near Vicksburg, Mississippi, a murder was committed by a gang of burglars. Of course, it must have been done by Negroes, and Negroes were arrested for it. It is believed that two men, Smith Tooley and John Adams, belonged to a gang controlled by white men, and fearing exposure on the night of July 4th, they were hanged in the courthouse yard by those interested in silencing them. Robberies since committed in the same vicinity have been known to be by white men who had their faces blackened. We strongly believe in the innocence of these murdered men, but we have no proof. No other news goes out to the world save that which stamps us as a race of cutthroats, robbers, and lustful wild beasts. So great is Southern hate and prejudice, they legally hung poor little 13-year-old Mildred Brown of Columbia, South Carolina, October 7th, on the circumstantial evidence that she poisoned a white infant. If her guilt had been proven unmistakably, had she been white, Mildred Brown would never have been hung. The country would have been aroused and South Carolina disgraced forever for such a crime. The Afro-American himself did not know as he should have known, as his journal should have been in position to have him know and act. Nothing is more definitely settled than he must act for himself. I have shown how he may employ the boycott, immigration, and the press, and I feel that by a combination of all these agencies can be effectually stamped out lynch law, that last relic of barbarism and slavery. The gods help those who help themselves. So this was the last section of Ida B. Wells' pamphlet on Southern horrors, and there's a lot to unpack here, but there are two major things that I take away from it. I want to go back and read the passage on self-defense. Of the many inhuman outrages of this present year, the only case where the proposed lynching did not occur was where the men armed themselves in Jacksonville, Florida, and Paducah, Kentucky, and prevented it. The only times an Afro-American who was assaulted got away has been when he had a gun and used it in self-defense. The lesson this teaches, and which every Afro-American should ponder well, is that a Winchester rifle should have a place of honor in every black home, and it should be used for that protection which the law refuses to give. When the white man, who is always the aggressor, knows he runs as great a risk of biting the dust every time his Afro-American victim does, he will have greater respect for Afro-American life. The more the Afro-American yields and cringes and begs, the more he has to do so, the more he is insulted, outraged, and lynched. That part could have been written today, right? And throughout the history of our country, the biggest fear of the powers in this nation have been three things. It has been a black person with an education, a black person with a voting ballot in his hand, and a black person with a gun. All the way up until the 1960s, there were laws on the books in this nation that effectively existed to do nothing more than prevent black people from getting an education, from voting, and from owning weapons. Well, we're now in a situation where we have access to education. It's comparatively cheap. Even without going to college and paying for that, we have Google, we have libraries, we have full and complete access to all of the information in the world, and we can access it at will, and nobody's going to stop us. We've overcome that barrier. We have the full and complete right to vote, mainly. Now, we still deal with redistricting and aligning districts in such a way that disenfranchises black people, or shutting down polling places in areas that are heavily
black populations. We still deal with that. But overall, we don't have an issue of trying to go vote and somebody saying, oh, you can't read, so you can't vote. Oh, you didn't pay the tax, so you can't vote. Oh, you tried to vote, I'm going to follow you home and we're going to kill you. We don't have that issue anymore. Black people can vote. We've overcome that barrier. But on the issue of having weapons to defend ourselves, not only have we not overcome that barrier, but we have become the biggest proponents for making that barrier even higher for us. And those are the three things that you've got to be able to have if you're going to be a full and equal citizen in this nation. You have got to be able to arm yourself mentally with knowledge and information. You have got to be able to choose who is going to represent you in the government. And you have got to be able right there at your home without having to call somebody else over. You have got to be able to defend yourself and your family from whatever aggressor. If you don't have those three things, you are not a citizen in the United States. It just doesn't happen for you. So I sincerely want the black community, our leaders in the black community, us normal people in the black community, to get a better understanding of just what it means to take advantage of Second Amendment rights, to get a better understanding of just what it means to be supporting gun laws that are, no matter how you say it, usually directed towards us. You know, it was stated a lot last year when Philando Castile was killed. Where's the NRA? Why isn't the NRA coming out for him? He had a concealed carry license. He told the officer that he had the weapon. He was following instructors. He was saying, yes, sir. And he was killed. Where's the NRA? And of course, we know exactly where they were. They were right where they've always been. The NRA doesn't exist to protect Second Amendment rights. It exists to protect Second Amendment rights for the white community. You know, we may not know this, but before the 1970s, the NRA was a proponent of gun control laws. Back in the 1960s, when the Black Panthers became a large force, back in the 1960s when in Oakland, the Black Panthers actually put together their police patrols, and these were black men in black neighborhoods in readily recognizable uniform, openly carrying loaded weapons in cars, following police patrols through their neighborhoods. And with them in their cars, they had copies of the statutes and the laws and the procedures that the police were supposed to follow, so that they knew whenever police interacted with a black person in those neighborhoods, they were following the letter of the law. And you know what they were doing was completely and totally legal. And they did that to protect the black community from police brutality in their neighborhoods, from murders of unarmed citizens in their neighborhoods. They couldn't get equal protection under the law, so they decided that they were going to follow and they were going to basically record the law. Didn't have video cameras or cell phones back then, and so you just had to have a notepad and a pencil and write down everything that happened. And you know what happened? Somehow, in the neighborhoods, fewer people were being brutalized by police. Fewer people were being killed by police. And these men were called radicals. Radical because they were exercising their Second Amendment right to protect their community. And in response to this policing of the police, then California Governor Ronald Reagan, yep, the same Ronald Reagan, the one who was 100% conservative values, 100% individual responsibility and total individual freedom, got to have the right to have a gun, got to have the right to be armed whenever you want to. That Ronald Reagan, yeah, he enacted gun control legislation in California that made it illegal for you to open carry. Why? Because black people with guns who were defending themselves against the state or people acting upon the orders of the state were a threat. So we needed to control guns, but really what we needed to control is these black people who are putting themselves in a position to defend against us. Let's strip those guns out of their hands. That's what gun control legislation was about. Now you fast forward 10 years, you have high unemployment, you have drugs infiltrating the community, you have more guns infiltrating the community, you have murders within the black community on the rise, and suddenly gun control is not such a big deal. Suddenly the NRA flips and they're against gun control. Suddenly those conservatives flip and they're against gun control. They roll back a lot of the gun control legislation from the 1960s because it wasn't about preventing deaths. It wasn't about preventing violence. It was about disarming the black threat. But when black people began to cannibalize each other, when the community turned and was divided on itself by drugs and poverty that were introduced from the outside in, well, now gun control not such a big deal. Have as many guns as you want. And then it became us, the ones saying, no, take the guns away from us. But it's always about controlling the community. But that was then. I guess the big thing that's on my mind, the thing I want to get across is we've gone through so many different eras and periods in this country and laws that were designed to prevent us from taking full advantage of our citizenship in this country. We've gone through social changes, political changes, technology changes, and now we are finally at a point in our nation as black people that we have the educational control. We have access to all the information that we could ever want. We have the ability to control the ballot box. We have the ability to go out and vote for people who actually serve our interests. Whatever party those people may have to be with, whatever their viewpoint, we have the ability to vote. And now we also have the ability to take control of our own personal defense by taking advantage of the same rights that the white population in this country have taken advantage of for their entire existence here. When things happen like Philando Castile being killed even though he was in complete compliance with the law, when things happen like Alton Sterling being killed, even though if he had a weapon, it was deep down inside of his pocket, both of his arms were pinned down, and he had no hand anywhere near it. When things happen like the tragedy that happened in Dallas with the guy who was shooting police officers, but CNN and other major news stations just caught a local picture of an innocent black man who had an AR-style rifle just slung over his back at the protest. They get his picture and they blast his picture out on the news as a suspect in this shooting, only because he was a black guy who was seen nearby with a gun and put his entire life in danger because the assumption of black man, gun, he must be the guy doing something wrong. When we see things like that happen, it discourages us. Those things discourage us and they teach us to fear having a weapon. It teaches us to fear exercising our rights to defend ourselves. It teaches us to teach our kids to stay away from weapons. Because even if they have a toy gun in the park by themselves, nobody else around, being black with something that looks like a gun is enough for a police officer to pull up on you, jump out of the car, and shoot you dead if you're black. When we see these things happen to us over and over and over and over and over again, we have been conditioned for our reaction to be, see, that's why we don't need to have guns. If we don't have guns, this won't happen to us. They won't confuse us for a threat if we don't have guns. Take the guns away from us. Get them out of our hands. That way they'll leave us alone. But that's not the way it works. It's never been the way that it works here. They spent 150 years telling us that we couldn't have guns, making sure that we couldn't protect ourselves. And somehow over the last 40, they've convinced us to make the argument for them. But a black man without a gun is still seen as just as much of a threat as a black man with a gun. Patrick Harmon, just this last week, Patrick Harmon, 50-year-old man in Salt Lake City, right? I don't know if you've seen the videos or not. There's a 50-year-old man surrounded by 3 police officers, 3 young police officers, one of whom at least we know is a military veteran just based on the way that he told this story. And he ran away from the police because he had a warrant. He even told the officer, "You're going to find a warrant." And he snatched away from 2 officers. He pushed another one away. He turned around and he ran. And as he was running away, one officer shot him with a taser, which slowed him down, made him start hobbling. He was basically incapacitated. And as he's incapacitated by this taser, another officer puts 3 rounds into his back. Their story is that he turned around real quick and he had a knife in his hand. They were so scared, had to put him down. 3 young officers, one of whom was a combat vet, faced with a 50-year-old man who was running away from them. But somehow he turned quickly. It alarmed them how close he was to them, and they had to shoot him and put him down. But he fell on his face, with his feet closest to the officers. Doesn't matter. Officer's story is what it is, and the prosecutor is not pressing charges. Because in this situation, a black man who may have had a knife, they say they found a knife near his body, but a black man who may have had a knife, who was running away from officers, was so much of a threat to these 3 much younger, much more fit men that they were terrified for their lives and they had to shoot him because he had a knife. Maybe. I read an article where the officer that was a combat vet, he said it was the scariest thing that he had ever experienced in his life. This man's been through combat, but the scariest thing he's ever experienced was a 50-year-old man who was running away from him and 2 of his fellow officers. So us not having guns isn't going to change that. I don't doubt at all that that officer is telling the truth. He was terrified. He was terrified he was going to die. Because here in the United States, the most terrifying thing to the population is a black person with an education, with a ballot in his hand, or with a gun to defend himself. And even when a black person doesn't have a gun, they are terrified of us. The only way that you keep something that you were so afraid of, so deathly afraid of, that even when he's running away from you, you think your life is in danger. The only way you keep that person in check is to disarm them mentally and physically and politically. It may feel like I've beaten this dead horse, but I can't say it enough. We have to get out of the mindset that the way that we solve crime problems, that the way that we solve murder rate problems, that the way that we solve problems in the black community is by taking guns away from those of us in the community who would use them to protect ourselves and our families and our community. Gun control is not criminal control. Gun control is not terrorist control. Gun control is not mental illness control. Gun control is black people control. In the larger community, gun control is law-abiding citizen control. When you disarm a populace, you can do to it whatever you wish. The white elements of our community understand this well. They will never, ever support giving up their gun rights. It won't happen. You could have an incident happen where a white man shoots 550 white people at a country music festival. And even then, people will go out the very next day and say, that's the cost of freedom. That's the price we have to pay. Those 60 lives and 500 people injured, that's the price we pay to be able to have our guns. Shrug it off. Keep it moving. You're not taking our guns away from us, because they know that a disarmed populace is an oppressed and controlled populace. And who is the most disarmed populace in the United States? Who has been systematically disarmed in every single way in the United States since this place existed? Us. And now we are the advocates for our own oppression, because we are the first ones to say, take the guns away. They will only be taken away from us. I say the exact opposite. Understand your Second Amendment rights. Learn how to properly use a weapon. Learn the 4 weapons conditions and make sure that you are always carrying your weapon safely. Go out and shoot your weapon. Train with it so that you know how to handle it. Be a responsible gun owner, but own a gun. Don't be afraid to own a gun. Don't allow the lawlessness of people in this community, not our community, the United States community. Don't allow the lawlessness of them assuming that a black person is a gun is a threat to make you feel too threatened to get a weapon to defend yourself. Take ownership of your citizenship. We need to take ownership of our citizenship. And the last piece of that puzzle is claiming for the first time in our history our Second Amendment rights, our rights as full and equal citizens to keep and bear arms. Because aside from owning our own businesses, having the wealth to influence politics, having the ability to physically defend ourselves and our property is the only other thing that is going to get us on equal footing with every other group in this country. It is a fool's errand. It is a pipe dream. It is a unicorn rainbow wish to believe that there will ever be a time in this nation with its entire hunting industry, with its entire sports shooting industry, with its whole call for a well-regulated militia. It is a pipe dream to ever believe that guns will be eradicated from this society. It will not happen. It's time for us to just decide we are part of this nation too. Black lives matter too. Black rights matter too. My right to defend my home and my family and my property with a gun is protected. And I'm going to take control and ownership of that too. That's where we are. That's where we need to be. The second piece of Ida Wells' pamphlet that I wanted to zero in on was the very next passage about the press. So I'll reread that again right now. The assertion has been substantiated throughout these pages that the press contains unreliable and doctored reports of lynchings. And one of the most necessary things for the race to do is to get these facts before the public. The people must know before they can act, and there is no educator to compare with the press. The Afro-American papers are the only ones which will print the truth, and they lack means to employ agents and detectives to get at the facts. The race must rally a mighty host to the support of their journals, and thus enable them to do much in the way of investigation. So what does this section tell us today in 2017? This was 1892, where the only way that information got out to the world was through newspapers. And the only way that the black perspective got out to the world and education out to the community was through newspapers. It was the press. Today in 2017, the concept is still the same. We see how we are represented on television. We see how our image is used. We see the angle of the stories that are told about us and about the people who do things to us in the press. And it's never told in such a way as to give our perspective, our point of view. It's never told in such a way as to educate the community on what's happening to us. It's always done in such a way as to tell them what it is that we could be doing, should be doing, or may be doing wrong. The stories are always used in such a way as to say, oh, look at those black people. They keep killing each other. Look at all that black on black crime. What about white on white crime? What about any other race on any other race crime? That's not even a thing. Nobody says white on white crime, Hispanic on Hispanic crime. The only terminology that they use for that is black on black crime. Even though in every demographic, 80+% of the crime that's committed against anybody in that race is by somebody else of that same race. Black people are no different. But stories about us are put out in such a way as to make us seem different, to make us seem lesser, to make us seem the same way that Ida Wells said that they make us seem. What was the terminology she used? Is it different from the terminology that is used about us today? Let's go find it. She said No other news goes out to the world save that which stamps us as a race of cutthroats, robbers, and lustful wild beasts. In 1892, the only news that went out to the world about black people was that we are cutthroats, robbers, and lustful wild beasts. Tell me that there is anything different about the way that the news media in all of its forms portrays us today. There's not. And just as she said then is what I'm saying now. The only way we change that, the only way we control that message is by creating our own platforms, our own press platforms, our own entertainment platforms, our own education platforms, where we can tell our story our way, where we can educate our community our way, where we can rally our community our way. If we don't have ownership of the platform, and if we don't support the platform, then we will have no voice speaking in our language to us and about us, or to the rest of the world about us. So she points out two things. We need to take control of our own self-defense, and we need to take control of our message through individual gun ownership and through developing and supporting our own media. And that brings it back to what this platform is about. This platform is one of our forms of our own media. So many other black podcasts out there are other forms of our own media that we should be supporting. For those who have the capital, creating our own television stations, supporting our own magazines, supporting our own newspapers, all of those other communication media out there that tell the black story from the perspective of black people, that educate the black community, not with an agenda that is paid for outside of our community, but by an agenda that is from within and for our community. We have to create and support our own platforms religiously. And that's the only thing that's on my mind for this week. So I appreciate you sticking through and listening to this, what I can only call a rant. If it's not your thing, I completely understand. If you disagree with me, I'm all up for debate. You can email me, reach out to me, gjones@buyblackpodcast.com. You can hit me up, tweet at me, hit me up on Instagram, hit me up on Facebook, it's at buyblackpodcast. In this particular episode, if you want to disagree, if you have a comment of your own, you can go into your podcast app, leave a comment, tell me what you think about gun control in the black community. I want to hear from you. I want to understand what the viewpoints are out there against this. I want to understand where everybody else is coming from. This is where I'm coming from. But let's have a conversation about it. Let's talk. In the meantime, I appreciate you guys listening, being out there, and interacting with me. And we'll catch you in the next episode. Out. Thank you for being part of the Buy Black podcast community. If you're enjoying the show, I'd appreciate reading your 5-star review in iTunes. Join us next time for another empowering episode.